All right. Hello, guys. So, if you are trying to get yourself familiar with the Dagster project, there's a high chance that your first point of contact or entry point is going to be the quick start guide in Dagster, right? And usually, once you initialize a project, you're expected to run a command called Dagster dev, right? And then once you run Dagster Dev, you end up with a web server and then you can interact with Dagster. If you're done with your evaluation locally, you're done with development and you're trying to go to production, how do you deploy Dagster, right? Dagster has a few options for deployment, and broadly, you can go like the open source route, or you can explore Dagster Plus, which also has different deployment options. In this video, we will be focusing on deploying open source Dagster. And even more specifically, if you're trying to deploy Dagster yourself, going the open source route, Dagster has a number of options. So, you can do like local deployment, Dagster as a service, you can explore Kubernetes. There's a bunch of them in the documentation for you to explore. In this video, we will even be drilling down more and be focusing on deploying Dagster using Docker Compose, right? Um, but before we jump into all of that, let's really explore what happens with Dagster Dev. Like, why is Dagster Dev such a convenient way to get started with Dagster? And then why shouldn't you go to production with Dagster Dev, or like what really happens behind the scene when you run or execute Dagster Dev? Okay, so when you execute Dagster Dev, usually what happens is that something called an instance, a Dagster instance, is spun up, and then you end up with two long running services. You end up with a web server, and you also end up with a daemon. Sometimes I get tempted and I want to call it daemon, but I'm not sure. But yeah, you end up with these two things, and what exactly are they? The web server is kind of like the GUI interface and pretty much the way majority of users will interact with a Dagster deployment. The daemon is a long running process, and it's basically the backbone or like the powerhouse for features like scheduling, for features like long running queues, for features like sensors. They rely on the daemon to work properly. And so you pretty much have these two long running services. But then, like I said, I've pointed out two things here. There's something called the Dagster instance, and then there's also something called a Dagster deployment, right? And the instance, well, we'll get into it a little bit more, but then the deployment will usually be composed of like at least two long running services, which is the web server and the daemon, right? The next thing you should know is that deployments are kind of like in two types, or Dagster. There are two types of Dagster deployments. You have something called an ephemeral deployment, and then you have something called a persistent deployment. And so what do we mean by this? Like the name suggests, an ephemeral deployment is one where once you start up your Dagster deployment, you can pretty much, get stuff done, but then the metadata that is generated, information about your runs, storage, all of that stuff are not persisted when you end your session or when you kill your Dagster deployment, right? So once you kill it, all of that information goes away, and then if you restart your deployment using Dagster Dev again, you don't have any of those information, so it's pretty much lost, right? And then for a persistent deployment, what that means is that you have data that is saved across sessions. So if I have like Dagster running powered by Dagster Dev, I can materialize a bunch of assets, and then after I kill my deployment and I start it again, I will not lose the information or the data or metadata from previous runs, right? So like, what causes this behavior? What you should know is that when you start or when you execute Dagster dev, the flow is pretty much that. First of all, you have this guy. Ooh. Okay. I didn't do too good there. Okay, so you have Dagster dev, and then what really happens is that behind the scene, Dagster looks for two things, right? Before you end up with like an instance, or before it decides how to start your instance. The first thing Dagster looks for is an environment variable called Dagster home, which basically informs whether Dagster has a dedicated location to store, all of this metadata from runs. And that's pretty much how it determines that, okay, hey, I'm going to spin up an ephemeral instance by creating like a temporary directory that will serve as my Dagster home. And then, I'm going to like basically store all of the metadata there. Or if this is set, then it means it has like a dedicated location. And so like across runs, every time Dagster starts and stops, it knows that there's a dedicated directory where it can save all of this information. The next thing Dagster looks for is your Dagster.yaml file. And this is used to configure your Dagster instance, right? The information there is used, it determines like what Dagster uses for storage. It determines like what Dagster uses when you try to like materialize an asset, all of those interesting things. They're basically controlled through this file, your Dagster.yaml file, right? And so like what you have is that Dagster initiates an instance, and then usually, your instance is powered by a web server and a daemon. So you're gonna have those two things and a daemon, right? So you essentially, like, this is the flow. So you execute Dagster dev, it looks for the Dagster home, it looks for Dagster.yaml. Also looks for like the workspace.yaml, but like, yeah, it looks for all of those information, and then it starts an instance, and then it basically spins up a web server and a daemon, right? That's pretty much the idea. Now, in a previous video, I spoke about code locations, right? And the idea with code locations is that there's better separation of concerns. I can have like multiple code servers, as they're called in Dagster. You can have multiple code servers, and these things are isolated. So you have like dedicated environments that can execute your code, with like specific, libraries and configurations that is just very specific to them, and there's no conflict. So teams can basically collaborate. But then when you run Dagster dev, what really happens? How does Dagster know about your code location? How does Dagster know where to look for your code? Well, I can show you. So pretty much, I'm going to stop this. And then we can go over it. So pretty much what really happens is that if you run Dagster dev and you don't have any additional argument, like you're not pointing Dagster to a module explicitly, or you're not pointing Dagster to a file explicitly, Dagster looks for your PyProject.toml file, and then within your PyProject.toml file, Dagster looks for a tool.dagster section, and then it looks for a module name src, right? And so here I have this directory, which is basically serving as my code location, or where my code is, where my code lives. And then I have this init.py file, and then I have a simple like definition here, or setup. So I have like a simple asset that's just the hello world asset, and then I have my devs, right? So if I do Dagster dev, right, notice also that here I'm not setting Dagster home. I don't have a Dagster.yaml file. None of that stuff is here. And so like, notice how there will be a new like temporary directory here when I execute this. So it comes up, and then it has all of these things. So it has like history for runs, and then this is kind of like a SQLite database that stores like metadata associated with runs, and then you have for schedules, and then it's pretty much the same vibe, right? And so if I execute this, I end up with this guy, which is in another screen. So I'm just going to bring it here, right? And then I have the asset called my asset. It's never been materialized before. And then if I materialize this asset, go and view the run, it gets materialized, right? And yeah, everybody's happy. But yeah, like I was trying to say, you see that it's been materialized now. If we come back here and I kill this guy using like Control C, I like to always clear my terminal and then just execute Dagster dev again. I'm not even going to follow this link. I'm just going to come back here and then I'm going to refresh. And then you see that it's never been materialized, right? So like what we have by just running Dagster dev without providing additional information, without doing additional configuration, is an ephemeral deployment, right? And I mean, if I set my Dagster home environment variable, I immediately transition to a persistent deployment, right? But then, you know, I may not want to store my configurations like this. You know, I may not want to use SQLite. I would probably want to use something else for storage, like Postgres or MySQL. You know, you can pretty much configure that. I may have opinions about like the default values for my Dagster instance, basically. So like my run launcher, I may have like a specific run launcher in mind, right? And so like we can configure all of that stuff. So when you start to think about production, right, the first question is like, what is the bare minimum? What do I need to, go to production with Dagster? Well, the bare minimum that you need is 2 long-running services. You need a web server, a Dagster web server, and I mean, you can get this by running Dagster web server or DG web server. There's a CLI command for it, basically, right? And then you also need, bare minimum, you need a daemon. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, right? So you need these 2 things. You need a Dagster web server, and then you need a daemon. Now, like I said, I may not be interested in like using SQLite as my back end for like storage, you know, and then I may be interested in exploring something other than like the core launcher, which is like default run launcher in Dagster. And so how do I configure all of those things? I configure them in the Dagster.yaml file, which is basically the instance configuration file, right? And if I decide that I'm, going to go to production, with like Postgres as my mechanism for storage, then it means that I also need a Postgres instance, right? I mean, no brainer. And then the next thing also is, I mean, my preference personally is to have code locations, right? So even if it's just a single code location, instead of controlling stuff like by looking for a module in my PyProject or TOML file, I would rather have at least one dedicated code location. In the future, I may choose to expand. I'm a big fan of separating transformation from like other stuff, so I would preferably have a code location for like my ETL workloads or my EL workloads or my ingestion workloads, and then have a dedicated code location for like my DBT workloads, right? And so yeah, you need at least one code location, right? And this, like I said, is optional. I mean, you can bundle stuff. That's totally up to you. So this are kind of like the things you pretty much need, right? And so like this is a service that you can execute on its own. You just need to provide it with certain information, furnish it with like information about like the instance configuration. The daemon is a long-running process that you can run on its own also. You just need to furnish it with information about the instance also. Your Postgres database, I mean, you can host that yourself, depending on your use case, right? Like if you are a large organization, you have like a lot of stuff to run, you probably want to like outsource this to something like RDS on AWS, and then you have like an dedicated RDS instance that's running, and that serves as your storage, what would I call it now, mechanism, right? For your Dagster deployment. So you can have this, and obviously, yeah, your code location can live in like separate repos. We explored this idea. You should check out the video. I'll put the link somewhere. But then, yeah, it's your setup can also be a monolith, right? And so, like, I mean, we will explore this through the lens of Docker Compose, right? Because that's kind of like the option we are going for. So I mean, my advice, if you're exploring this approach, it means that you're working on maybe like a small scale, a medium scale Dagster project, or you have to like do stuff on prem. I mean, we will look at some of the disadvantages of trying to go this route, and we will look at some of the reasons why you should probably explore Dagster Plus at the end of the video. But then, yeah, this is pretty much what you need. So I have a code repo. Um, I mean, I have it opened on GitHub, but then I'm going to pretty much like show you what the structure looks like locally first, and then I mean we can look at it on GitHub, and then I have it running on EC2. It's deployed on EC2 right now, and then like we can look at it from there also. But it doesn't have to be EC2. It doesn't have to be AWS. You just need a machine, right? And then once you have a machine, you can run Docker Compose anywhere. Docker Compose can run. I mean, this setup can pretty much run, right? But then, yeah. So here what I have is a folder where I have like two code locations. One of it is just to kind of like, keep the idea going that you can actually have multiple code locations and your setup can actually be a monolithic setup. You don't have to like build like multiple GitHub repos and have like that service orientation. But if you're working with a large team, I strongly recommend that you have dedicated repos where you have all of these things, because essentially you will end up with a Docker image. That's the asset that needs to go to production, and then these things can be built from anywhere, sent to a central container registry, and then I mean you can pull it down from there, and then you have data ingestion also, where I have my definitions. I have a simple asset, a bunch of them. I have like my init.py file where I've defined my assets, and then we will go into like the deployment stuff. But then also we have like Dagster OSS here, another like folder, and here I have configured my Dagster instance, right? There's solid documentation about Dagster instances and configuring them, or your Dagster instance configuration. And so like you need to check like the Dagster documentation for that. You'll find all of this stuff. But then here I am using a Docker run launcher, and I will explain why in a second. But yeah, I have this, and then I have storage, and my storage is going to be Postgres, and then my run coordinator is kind of like the core run coordinator, and then my scheduler is like the core scheduler. It's coming from like Dagster core, right? Now let's talk about why. I mean, I will typically personally frown at deploying stuff using maybe something like Docker or Docker Compose on EC2 or like a virtual machine, and then why I think Dagster is so awesome, and like why it's like super cool. So usually after you do local development, right, you have to go through like this cycle, right? Your development cycle, where you develop locally, you push to a future branch, you merge to a main branch, and then after you merge to the main branch, you initiate well, it depends, right? You initiate your CI checks to confirm that like code is doing what you expect, has the correct behavior, and then if those checks pass, then you initiate your CD pipeline, or your continuous deployment pipeline, where you want to pretty much deliver that code to production. Now, depending on what you are running, right? Like if I have a service that is running on an EC2 machine powered by something like Docker or Docker Compose, usually what this means is that once I build a new image, I have a new image version, I have to go into the instance, whether through an automated process or manually. I have to stop what's currently running, and then I need to restart it, right? And like why is this bad? It's bad because imagine you have this pipeline that is running, and then it probably takes 25 minutes to complete, and then while it's in the process of like running, I mean, an engineer on your team makes a change and then pushes that change to production. And then after pushing that change to production, it has to kind of like generate the image, SSH into the EC2 instance, kill the instance, right? So whatever process is running on the instance just dies, or I mean, is forced to stop. And then, it has to rebuild that service or restart that service using the new image, right? So like, I mean, you can automate that process, but there's a high chance that you will interrupt something running in production, and that sucks. And how is Dagster awesome? Like, why wouldn't this be a problem if you decide to go with Docker Compose as your option for deployment? Well, it won't be a problem because of this thing called the Docker Run launcher, right? So the idea is that you pretty much have, I mean, a number of services. So I'm just gonna one, two. Let's say you have your daemon, you have your web server, you have your code location, right? And then, I mean, you have something running. Usually, when you launch a run, what happens behind the scene is that Dagster starts a new container, right? And this is where the run is happening. So you have these services. I'm just going to tag them to make it easier. So you have these services running. So even though like you have a code location here, and then let's say you make changes to your code location and you deploy those changes, restarting the code location does not affect like ongoing runs, because what happens is that a new container is spun up and then the run is executed within that container. And so like whatever you are doing against your code location, restarting the code location for any reason does not affect ongoing runs. And that just makes, I mean, like this whole setup like feasible. It makes it work. It makes it something that can be adopted in a production environment where you want to do CI/CD. I mean, that's just awesome. And so the idea here that I've set up in this reference repository, I'm going to put the link somewhere in the video description, is that I typically have two pipelines. So one to manage code locations, and specifically one to manage my data ingestion code location, and then I have one to manage like Dagster OSS, right? So I have two images. I have an or let's say three, right? I mean, the daemon and the web server can be based off of the same image, right? So like, I mean, a single Docker file. And so basically I have those two things, and then I have my image that is specific to the code location. So if we look in the workflow file, what I'm doing is pretty much simple, right? Every time I check in code and there's a change that has been detected, on this part, which is the data ingestion code location, or on this part, which is kind of like this file, right? What I do is I invoke this pipeline. And what this pipeline does is it pretty much builds a new Docker image. It pushes it to Docker Hub. And then it's after the image is in Docker Hub, it SSH into my EC2 server. And then it pretty much invokes a restart of my code location, to reference the latest image, right? I'm doing some other things there, which I'm going to talk about. Like I said, or maybe I didn't. The goal here, like the intent in this video, is to kind of like give you all of the raw materials and like help you build the right mental model for thinking about deploying Dagster open source. It's not necessarily to give you like the most efficient or like a production ready repository, right? There are many things I would do differently if I was actually going to production with this, but then this is proof that the idea works, and you can bake in all of the other components by yourself, basically, right? So with this setup, I have something that's working, and I mean I can show you what it looks like here. Go to assets. You can see from okay, I'm not sure you can see the URL, like the URL is probably cut out, but then like I am in a I'm in, and like this is from an EC2 instance. I'm referencing like a public IP address that's exposed, and then I have like all of these assets here, right? And then also this is powered by Postgres, which is also like an image. If we come back here in my Docker Compose, yeah, the Dagster daemon, I have the web server, I have ingestion, and yeah, I have Postgres. So this is pretty much like what powers storage for my Dagster deployment, pretty much. Yeah. And so before I round up this video, there's one last thing I would like to touch on. Right. Okay. So how do you prepare for production? How do you go to production? What are usually like the usual suspects, or like the usual, like the things you will typically think about in a production environment, right? Now, if you have multiple code locations, right, it means that you need like an established process for like CI/CD to kind of like manage these things. If you're thinking CI/CD, then automatically also you'll be thinking about how to manage your Docker images, right? So you need a container registry. The next thing is secrets are part of like pipelines. It's very normal. You have sensitive credentials, that helps you to access APIs, help you to access database, third-party systems, and all of that stuff. So you need some sort of established way to manage secrets, to manage sensitive credentials. Right now, the pattern I'm using in this particular deployment is to add it as part of the deployment, which doesn't necessarily make sense. Like continuously pushing the secrets every time a particular code location gets updated can be painful, right? I mean, we're managing the secrets centrally in GitHub, right? But I mean, we should probably consider moving the secrets elsewhere, somewhere like Secrets Manager or something, and then have like an established pattern for, like pushing secrets, managing secrets, evolving them, even discovering them like within our project, right? So like that's something to think about. Something else to think about is authentication and authorization, or role-based access control. Authorization, right? I mean, you have to think about this. And then something else to think about, which is very important, is alerting or monitoring, basically, right? Like alerting is non-negotiable, right? You can have a pretty decent CI/CD process in place. You can have feature branches, you can probably have like multiple Dagster deployments, and then you can push to one test, and then you can merge to another branch, and then you can push it into like a production instance. Yeah, but that's painful, right? You can find like an established way to manage secrets by yourself. Container registry, well, you can go away from Docker Hub and use container registry on any of your cloud providers, or like a private container registry. That's up to you. That's easy and straightforward. Authentication and authorization, well, in your open source deployment, you'll have to do extra work to kind of like create some sort of security wall in front of your Dagster deployments, just so that a random person on the internet who happens to stumble on like your Dagster deployment URL doesn't just go there and mess up your project, right? Or you can set it up in such a way that you can't access this project if you're not behind the VPN, right? Authorization, well, I don't think you have that in like Dagster open source, I guess. So that's probably a feature of Dagster Plus. And then alerting also, right? Like there are all these cool policies if you're exploring on like Dagster Plus that you probably wouldn't get with like Dagster open source. So it's kind of like extra effort for you to like establish a pattern for handling alerts and all of that stuff. And also something very cool to call out about Dagster Plus is Dagster Plus has something called feature branches, I think. Yeah, feature branches, and like that's kind of like probably, I don't know, a reason to consider like doing Dagster Plus. But if you want to do Dagster open source, if you want to deploy projects using Dagster open source, I believe that within like the code repository, there are kind of like recipes that can help you to kind of like think about it, and then you can plan around these things, and that would pretty much kind of like help you to get started. I intend to make another video where I go on like, a talk about a more production ready version of this code. But yeah, I mean, watch out for that. But this is pretty much everything I wanted to share about thinking about Dagster deployments. Hopefully you understand what happens when you execute Dagster dev now. You understand the services you need to like spin up if you want to deploy Dagster open source by yourself. And if you're thinking of, like rolling or running with this idea to go to production, something to call out is that like fault tolerance is kind of like poor in this particular setup. What else? I mean, there are a few things. The coordination is pretty tardy, right? So like, I mean, there are some manual steps that I didn't really go into here that you will have to deal with. What else? Right? I mean, and then it might be a bit overwhelming if you want to roll out like Postgres on Docker Compose to put Postgres, your web server, your daemon, and then like your code locations in the same EC2 instance. I mean, that can be vertically scaled, but you may want to like distribute all of those things across like different instances. We didn't talk about workspaces.yaml in this video, but then I believe that I addressed it in the code location video, so you should definitely check that out. Yeah, this is everything I wanted to share with you. Hopefully, this helps somebody out there. This helps you to build, the right mental model for thinking about deploying Dagster on your own, and I mean, if you want to do this on-prem, you want to do this on the cloud, yeah, I mean, have fun. And if you have questions, put them in the comments. Please like, subscribe, share, do all that good stuff. But until next time, thank you for watching this video. Bye.